Sojourner Truth, Women, Writers, and Activists series. The person in the back of the room, at the appropriate time, stood up and began walking to the front of a full room of white women. The person was almost 6 feet tall and had dark, weathered skin, an old dress, and a bonnet on her head. This woman was Sojourner Truth. The name Isabella Bampre was in the past. Sojourner Truth had chosen her own name, dropping the last name of her former slave owner. Every eye in the room was on the confident, imposing figure of Truth as she made her way to the podium. They were in Akron, Ohio, and the year was 1851. Slavery was no longer legal in the North. Still, the only people allowed to vote were white men. Going back in time, Sojourner Truth was purchased at the age of 9 for $100 and a flock of sheep by a cruel man named John Neely. His physical abuse was constant until Truth was again sold to another trader of people, John Dumont, who promised her that she would be given her freedom on July 4, 1826. As you might expect, the moral compass of someone who enslaves others was not entirely trustworthy, and he refused to follow through on his word. But Truth had had enough. Finishing what she felt were her final duties and leaving the plantation, she stated, quote, "I did not run off, for I thought that wicked, but I walked off, believing that to be all right," end quote. A year previous to her famous speech in Akron, she published her autobiography, The Narrative of Sojourner Truth, by way of Oliver Gilbert, to whom Truth dictated her story. The proceeds from her autobiography funded her travels and provided her with national notoriety. Truth gave speeches at many places discussing the horrors of enslavement. But her speech in Akron before a large group of white women suffragists would take a different turn. Her voice boomed throughout the room, taken down phonetically by Francis Gage, another attendee in the crowd. Some people today disagree with exact phonetic transcription across ethnic lines, but this is the record that we have. You can find the speech in a link below. This speech came to be titled, "Ain't I a Woman?" and if you read the short text you will see why. In it, Truth asks why women of color are not included in the white women's pursuit of the vote. She details the tragic events of her enslavement, such as having many of her children sold into slavery, punctuating each event with the question, "And ain't I a woman?" referring to the injustice of excluding women of color from the women's suffrage movement. This strategy is typical of historical movements, wherein one group feels that their own goals are more easily accomplished if others don't join them. This is where the very idea of equality meets a mountain of irony. In fact, this was not the only front on which women of color would be excluded in the interest of another group. The famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass enjoyed his own fame and worked to gain the vote for men of color. Once on friendly terms with Truth, Douglass bristled at the idea that black women should join the movement. There was Sojourner Truth, not white enough for the women's suffrage movement and not male enough for the African-American pursuit of the vote. In the end, it would be the men of color who would gain the vote decades before women. Nevertheless, Truth would accomplish a great deal in her life, not the least of which was passing legislation along with Abraham Lincoln, who it seems was smart enough not to tell Sojourner Truth no. In their first meeting, Lincoln showed Truth a Bible given to him by a group of African Americans. You may recognize this as an early example of, "I'm not racist, see, I have lots of black friends." In addition, Truth worked tirelessly to recruit African American men to fight for the Union during the Civil War and collected supplies for newly arrived former slaves from the South. Sojourner Truth also had a hobby, which was getting on illegally segregated trolley cars in the North, once being physically assaulted by a trolley driver. Truth did not rest until that trolley driver was arrested, and he eventually was. In later years, Sojourner Truth also operated her own underground railroad, much like Harriet Tubman, and created safe passage to the North for formerly enslaved people from the South. A truly full life in the pursuit of justice. Now, to put it in Truth's own words at the end of her "Ain't I a Woman" speech, quote, "Obliged to you for hearing me, and now old Sojourner ain't got nothing more to say," end quote. There are a handful of links below to various sources to continue further research on this woman if you wish, or find your own sources to expand your knowledge about this woman and other women, writers, and activists. Check out other historical figures in the quest for justice on this channel in the Women, Writers, and Activists series. Source credits for this podcast can be found below.